thank you for joining us today. It's true, I did fly in from Toronto yesterday, but I'm based in the UK for off and on for the next 10 months as part of Leverhulme Trust Visiting Professorship. So I'm here for some time. And I'm also an associate professor at Toronto Metropolitan University, based in Toronto, Canada. And I'm being hosted through this visiting professorship by the Treated Spaces Research Group, which is based at the University of Birmingham. So thank you to them as well. And thank you to you for coming out today. So I think there's a lot of intersections that we can draw from the talk I'm about to share here. Just based on the fact that we're at this museum. There's also connections to British treaty-making history with Anishinaabe or Indigenous peoples in North America. So I won't be surprised if this goes in a lot of different directions. So I do welcome anything that you see in the talk that you want, any direction you want to take us, please do. I'll do my best to keep up. Obviously I do have a specific kind of line or argument or kind of focal point to share with you today, but we can leap off that and take the discussion where we will. So a little bit more about me. Where am I from? The big red balloon is Fort William First Nation, which is an Anishinaabe community in Canada on the north shore of Lake Superior. We measure distance in hours. So it's about an hour and a half drive to the American border for us, maybe 100 kilometers. Anishinaabe is the Ojibwe's name for Ojibwe people, right? So you might have heard Chippewa or Ojibwe. Those are both also terms that Anishinaabe go by, but the Anishinaabe term for Anishinaabe is that. You might hear me say, just as a point of terminology, you might hear me say Anishinaabe or Anishinaabeg. The G at the end connotes plurality. So if you hear me saying those two words, this is why. But we'll see. We'll see if that comes up. So this is a particular importance right now because Fort William First Nation is one of 12 Robinson Superior Treaty bands. So in Canada, we go by bands or First Nations or First Nation communities. And the Robinson Superior Treaty is kind of a hot topic in Canada right now. I won't get into the nuts and bolts of this, but if you know something about it, we can talk about it later. It's a treaty between Anishinaabe of the North Lake Superior region and the British Crown from 1850. So before Canada was a state or a dominion. And right now, the reason it's so kind of provocative is that Anishinaabe took the Canadian and province of Ontario, the two crowns, to court over treaty annuity issues and won, and it's now in a settlement phase. So there's a lot of talk in Canada, especially Ontario right now, about the Robinson Superior Treaty and its sister treaty, the Robinson-Huron Treaty. We won't really get into that here today, but I just want to point that out in case you are aware of that current discussion and want to talk about it. So a little bit about me. So in addition to what you've heard so far, I have a PhD in Indigenous Studies from the University of Manitoba, in addition to the other kind of things I mentioned earlier. But just more about me as me. I was adopted into Fort William First Nation as a toddler in 1980. So this is a picture of my dad. So I'm on the far left, my brother and my sister. And importantly, I was adopted through Anishinaabe law. So not federal law and not any kind of provincial iteration of adoption law or whatever the case may be. I was adopted through the law that my grandmother, Geraldine McLaren, carried through her, through her upbringing. She was exposed to the traditions around adoption in her family as well. You'll see more about why that's the case in a few minutes. But that's really critical. So in Indigenous studies, as a discipline, we take standpoint or positionality or your personal experiences quite seriously in research. It opens up a broader discussion about what is objectivity. We don't need to get into that. But I bring in these stories about myself because my research ultimately, and most Indigenous studies researchers, try to serve their communities in some way. So when I was trying to figure out why am I going to talk about adoption and as a research topic, it was clear to me that my community had a bit of a gap around this as a political concept to discuss. So what could I give back to my community? Well, I can give back something that I know a lot about, and it's adoption. So I focused my PhD studies on not just adoption as a family making practice, but as a tool of citizenship making, okay? So I am a member of Fort William First Nation, like formal member. I'm also been made a citizen of the Anishinaabe Nation, not just through my own family's adoption, or the decision to adopt me, but through the fact that my broader community has also assessed me over decades and have also now accepted me, a long time ago, not like, it wasn't like last week or anything, but over my lifetime, I've been made a citizen of the nation through the practice of adoption, which is very different than how a lot of other Indigenous or Indian identities in Canada are constructed. They're very legalistic, they're very legislative, they're very controlled by the Canadian state. There is a competing legal order in Canada. I should say legal orders. Indigenous nations have their own legal orders that bump up against and compete with the presumed legal order established by the state. So as I mentioned, I'm just also a band member at Fort William First Nation. I'm not a status Indian. There's a difference there. It's a legal designation that's controlled by the state. I'm not an Indian under Canadian law, but I strangely am also a non-status Indian. It's a designation that, now we're splitting hairs, but there's all these layers of identity control and formation in Canada that really do kind of like complicate and muddle the waters around belonging, identity, and even adoption. So I'm telling these things on purpose, not to confuse you, but just to show that this is not a straightforward argument. It's not a straightforward kind of state of being in Canada. Indigenous identities and Indigenous citizenship laws are constantly being bombarded by different concepts and ideas and laws about Indianness and belonging. So my research focuses specifically on the resurgence of Indigenous political and legal orders or systems. I specifically focus on citizenship governance. There's many other areas of political and legal research that I could focus on, but I look at citizenship specifically. So a little bit more about today's talk. Why are we all here? So I'm going to be talking about adoption as a citizenship making practice. I'm going to share a few stories. So this is not going to be all academics. I'm going to share a story specifically about a person named Frankie Banning, who is also an adoptee into my community, and he was adopted decades ago. I'll also touch on things like Canada's Indian Act. We can't really have this conversation now without also talking about some of the hurdles that are placed in front of Indigenous nations. And in Canada, one of the major hurdles is the Indian Act, specifically how it creates the concept of Indianness. In the Canadian context, Indianness is constructed as a distortion of indigeneity. They're not the same thing. The Indian Act is the legal structure that upholds the state's control over its own definition about Indianness. And then we'll move into the kind of like the key parts of what I want to talk about today, which is looking for law, finding law, specifically citizenship law in the context of adoption. So this is a general roadmap of where we'll get to today. Hopefully it allows you to hang on as I kind of like dip and dive as we go through here, but this is generally where we'll go. And there will be time for discussion at the end. So I do welcome your questions. So the main argument, this is what I'm going to like drill down on today. As First Nations in Canada seek to rebuild their existing legal systems, they can and do find guiding principles in existing practices. Indigenous nations in North America, specifically Canada, continue to use their own legal systems in various ways, sometimes visible, sometimes under the radar. And these are both intentional. The under the radar part is part of surviving the violence of colonialism. But in addition to that, as they rebuild those systems of law and governance, there are also guiding principles that they can draw out of those systems and those practices that help to inform the rebuilding process in such ways that maintain and express, I would call congruency or cultural continuity, right? All these terms could be used in different ways, but in ways that guide the rebuilding process to ensure that they are as closely aligned with the principles and values of those nations as possible, as opposed to simply adopting the, I guess, the concepts or the precepts that are found in, say, Indian Act or colonial legislation. So I apply this, obviously, to citizenship law specifically, and I'm going to be looking at how Anishinaabe communities in the Northern Great Lakes use family-making practices to not only renew their families, but to renew the nations. Okay, and obviously I'll be talking specifically about adoption. So a little bit of a story. I took this picture. It's part of a wall that just kind of looks like one of these walls here in our community center, the Fort William First Nation Community Center, right at the center of my community. It's where bingo happens. It's where community events happens. There's an elder center there. It's kind of multi-purpose. But kind of tucked away in the main hallway near the end of the hall, there's this, what I call the Hall of Fame. Technically, it's the Community Achievement Awards, but the community, the band, goes out of its way to celebrate certain members that have done something for the community. So you can see there's a few people there. And these are all Fort William First Nation band members. It's a legal designation, but they all belong with Fort William First Nation in different ways. But I'm going to draw your attention specifically to the bottom left. So this is just a blown up picture of the bottom left. So this is a picture of Frank Banning, now passed away. He is my grandmother's brother. So I guess they make him my great uncle. And he is non-Indigenous by birth. So he's Italian-Canadian by birth. And he was adopted into Fort William First Nation in the 1930s or so through, similar to me, through Anishinaabe customary adoption practice. So my great-grandfather, Jacob Bannon, he adopted Frankie and his sister and brought them into the community through Anishinaabe law. If you're wondering why you might have caught there's a difference there between Bannon and Banning, when he was, I can't remember how old he was, I'm going to get this piece wrong. He wasn't old enough to join the army, but in the Second World War, he lied about his age to get onto the Canadian Army lists. And so the way he did that partially was by changing the ending of his last name from Bannon to Banning, because he could use basically a way around the system and basically essentially lie about his age. So he did that, and this is why it's Banning, just in case you're wondering. So adopted into Fort William as a young child, grew up on the reserve. So this is right next to Thunder Bay, same reserve that I'm from. But importantly, he was claimed in at least 3 different ways. He was claimed not only as a Fort William First Nation band member, right? So his name is on the band membership list. He was also claimed by Fort William as Anishinaabe. So he's not narrated as, Italian-Canadian adoptee, Frankie, who's on our band list. He's narrated as Anishinaabe. And he's also a status Indian. We don't need to get into the mechanics of this, but the legislation changes over time. So at that time, he was able to qualify to be registered as an Indian under Canadian law. And Frankie's story is going to be really important to our discussion today. I'm bringing him up now to introduce him to you, but also just to flag that Fort William and other Anishinaabe communities have long histories of adopting people. Sometimes those people that are adopted are Anishinaabe at birth. Sometimes, though, there is adoption of non-Indigenous people at birth who then are brought into the community, and through systems and long-term assessments are either claimed or not claimed. There are stories, and we're not going to touch on them today, but there are stories where families did adopt non-Indigenous children into Fort William and ultimately excluded them ultimately decided, no, you're not really upholding the ways that we want to live our lives here, and so we're not claiming you as adults, even though you may have paperwork that say you belong to us. The point here is that this is intentional. There is a system at play, and part of what my research is all about is looking to those systems and making them visible so that they can be drawn upon and discussed. So just moving back into a little more academics here, I will come back to Frankie's discussion later. But for 175 years, the Canadian government has attempted and also just simply done the regulation of Indigenous identities through the Indian Act. This is done through constructing what the state says is an Indigenous person that at times borrows from, overlaps with Indigenous notions of identity and belonging, but ultimately are very separate things. I'll get into why they're separate in a moment. But as I mentioned, an Indian in Canadian society and Canadian law and legislation is a few things at once. It is a legal identity according to legislation, but Indigenous peoples also use the term to connote, to describe themselves as well. So it's not cut and dry in the sense that like Indian is only a state-based thing. There is kind of like bleed over and kind of usage of terminology. So even in discussions like this today, it's easy to kind of like step into different definitions of the term. But the way I'm thinking about it now is that this term really kind of has a history in Canadian state making, in Canadian legislative history. So it really starts in 1850. So this is drawing on before 1850 of like common parlance of how to describe indigeneity, right? So Indianness in the United States and in Canada, obviously, was a general term for a very long time that gets brought into law and legislation in different ways. Canadian history tends to be a little bit different than in its usage of the term, at least in the legislation now. But it comes from a history in itself that does speak to a way of defining and describing those, what we might now describe as Indigenous nations of North America. But in the Canadian context, it gets solidified in 1876 under the Indian Act. Okay, so the Indian Act really is the piece of legislation that goes about defining indigeneity for the state's purposes, not necessarily for Indigenous purposes. So if you go to your phone now and type Indian Act Canada, the Act will still come up, right? This is just a screenshot I took of the Canadian federal government's website. And clearly, it's still in play. It still defines indigeneity for the state's purposes. Section 6, if you're curious about that or if you know about this, right, it speaks to the persons who are entitled to be registered as an Indian, okay? These, as I mentioned, these can conflict with Indigenous nations' notions of identity and belonging. So Indianness really is about resources, money, and ultimately really getting rid of Indigenous people in the Canadian context. The Indian Act is not there to uphold and recognize Indigenous nationhood, but it really is a tool of eradicating Indigenous nations as nations through individual level kind of like identity construction out of existence. It's highly gendered. So for a very long time, to be an Indian in Canada meant you had to be a male Indian or married to a male Indian or be a descendant of a male Indian. There's a whole history and a whole body of knowledge around how Indigenous women were excluded from Indianness through marriage, lost their Indian status according to the state because they married a non-Indian, who may have also been an Indigenous person who just didn't have the recognition from the state, etc. It's also a really heteronormative concept. So to produce Indian children under the way that Indianness is constructed, you need male-female pairings. There's no space for queer or two-spirit family making under the Indian Act, and it's kind of like, the way it's been constructed for a very long time. It's starting to shift now, but it kind of rests on these notions of what counts as a true Indian. It also really constructs a biologized identity. So Indianness really becomes who you're either married to, who you're descended from, not necessarily the nation who claims you. It really is individualized, and it kind of divorces and ignores Indigenous nationhood, which I think is really kind of critical and what I tend to focus on. So just a little bit more about why it's connected to resources and whatnot. So I'm just going to draw a couple of quotes from my colleague Pamela Palmater. So she writes about the Indian Act and its kind of effect on Indigenous identity formation. So I'll just quote this, read this for you. So she writes, "What is happening in the Indian Act is a legislated form of population reduction based on the goal of assimilation. The ultimate effect of the Indian Act is to reduce the number of people the government must be accountable to in terms of protection, treaty obligations, land rights, self-government, and other Aboriginal rights. The historical record clearly shows, that's me, that cost reduction is the ultimate objective." So it's really just a way to move away from Indigenous nations as treaty partners and move away from Indigenous nations as a concept that Canada has to deal with. Now, Indigenous people constructed through Indianness now are simply a subset of the Canadian population amongst the broader multicultural population that Canada envisions for itself. But that's not to say that Indigenous nations haven't brought some of those concepts into how they can envision themselves as well. So there's an entanglement that happens here. So again, Pamela Palmater discusses the effects on identity and belonging when kind of looking at the Indian Act's effect on Indigenous self-conception. So I'll just quote again here from her book from 2011. So she says here, "Federal control over Indianness and membership have become the primary filter through which government, society, and even some Aboriginal groups have come to view Aboriginal peoples." I would go beyond the word some. I would say that many Aboriginal Indigenous nations have not really kind of like broken free of deeper concepts of Indianness under the legislation. So if that's the case, if Indigenous nations are trying to rebuild their systems of governance, including citizenship, what can be done, or what might the resurgence of those Indigenous citizenship laws look like if and when we account for the fact that Indianness as a concept can infiltrate and even shape Indigenous notions of belonging? Basically, my argument is that Indigenous nations continue to do this. Part of the work that me as an academic, but also the people I work with at community level who are not academics, part of the work that we do is discuss where do we find the principles and guiding aspects of specifically Anishinaabe law that are, I don't want to say that are not affected by, say, Indianness or those kinds of like sorts of control on nations, because we've been living with the Indian Act for such a long time that it makes sense that some of those concepts have kind of like moved into our own consciousness. But the risk there is that in rebuilding or reestablishing Indigenous citizenship laws, the risk is that some of those concepts that we've learned under the Indian Act may be imported into the resurgence of law as we build it now. So for example, does it make any sense to construct Anishinaabe citizenship systems or laws that are highly gendered in the way the Indian Act was, or highly heteronormative? To me, that just reproduces the problem. And this is how these logics work. They harness you in as you go about doing the work to resist them. This is how it works. So ultimately, I would say that kinship is a really critical piece of thinking through how do we challenge those logics that construct indigeneity and harness communities' energies and thinking around trying to resist them without reproducing them in the process. So I'm going to introduce this concept of kinship and unpack it a bit more, and then we're going to turn back to a story about Frankie Banning, and then I promise I'll be wrapping up soon. So what is kinship? In some ways, we might think that the Indian Act, under its kind of like the ways it relies on sexual pairings to produce Indian children, is a form of kinship. I would say that's true, but that's a very narrow construction of what kinship actually is. It is family, but it's also broader than that. So kinship, in some ways, some people have described it as owning one's relationships, right? So if we are in a kinship relationship together, I go out of my way to make sure that you are cared for. And importantly, I do that by being proactive about it. So I'll give you a bad example. If I borrow 10 pounds from you, and I say I'll pay you back in a week, and I don't, and 2 weeks go by, and 3 weeks go by, and suddenly you find yourself in a position where you got to chase me for that 10 pounds, the relationship is going to be strained, right? It puts stress on that relationship. Whereas if I show up on time and I pay you back on time, that proactivity not only is an agreement, but being proactive, it allows that relationship to stay balanced and continue on in the future in a good way. It's one of the ways that I kind of think about kinship in terms of owning those relationships. It's about family. So when we think about family and kinship, we can think about your cousins, your broader family, your nuclear family. It's not just necessarily limited to that nuclear element. The way that some Anishinaabe knowledge holders think about kinship is that it's a circle. And in that circle, when you bring people into it, it presents responsibilities and it presents certain requirements to maintain those relationships in a good way. So I'll throw some Anishinaabe language at you, Wiitgaamaganuk. So this is from Anishinaabe knowledge holder James Mishkort, or Jimmy Mishkort, from Rocky Bay First Nation. This is a community right next to mine in Northern Ontario, and he's a respected elder. So James, or Jimmy, when he worked with my family and I sat with him and learned some of these things, he used this term Wiitgaamaganuk, and he defined that as a process of adoption, but not just as only adoption, but as the circle that you draw around your family. So if you think about your own families, you just know at an emotional level, and even probably at a narrated level, who's inside your family and who's outside your family. And there's always those people on the kind of like in the gray area. And I think that that is a common human condition, that sometimes there's people that are brought out and sometimes there's people that are excluded, right? Maybe they're not upholding their responsibilities. Maybe they're violent. Maybe there's something else happening, that after a lot of attempts, they are told they cannot be inside the circle anymore. And vice versa, those that you want to bring into that circle. Maybe you want to have children, they come into the circle. Maybe you marry somebody, they come into the circle, adoption. But the way that Jimmy Mishkort talks about kinship and family is that circle. And everybody's circle is different. And adoption in this context, through Anishinaabe understandings of Wiitgaamaganuk, this circle, it's the process of bringing somebody inside that circle. Really interestingly, Anishinaabe adoption is not limited to only children. You can adopt elders, you can adopt adults. But specifically, the way I'm talking about it just now is the focus on the child. But if you bring in a child through this process, you're bringing them in a way that solidifies bonds, confirms responsibilities, mutual responsibilities, not just you to the child, but the child to you, right? And also confirms that child's place in the family. Importantly, unlike a lot of other kind of adoption laws in Canada, this approach to adoption is very public. Everybody knows about it. It's not kept a secret, including the adoptee. The child knows that they are adopted, and they are celebrated as someone who's brought in through adoption. And they are encouraged to have a relationship with their birth parents, if it's safe to do so. This is not just at Fort William. Other Anishinaabe communities do this, and it's meant to be an expression of law, but it's also meant to create a memory or a record in the community. So everybody knows that this child is brought in through adoption for things like, well, who can they marry in the future, right? The community needs to know that. They need to know if that child is related to certain people that maybe they shouldn't be marrying. And et cetera. I won't spend too much more time on this, but like the point is there is a process in place for this. And it forms these bonds that then the child is meant to uphold through the rest of their life. and sometimes they don't, and this is why citizenship is a decision later on. So this was, again, my grandmother's brother. So one of the ways that Frankie upholds the responsibilities he was given as a child, as an adoptee, was he helps people his whole life. When I interviewed people at Fort William for my dissertation, his name came up. And his name came up partially because he was an adoptee, but also because he was so kind to everybody. He would proactively show up with firewood cut and split and dried for elders in the fall to give them for the winter. He would do things like care for the land and etc. He was well known as somebody who cared for the community. Now we could maybe reduce that to just personality. Maybe that's true. But it carried through his life to the point that even after he died, and I start asking questions about, well, what happens when somebody is adopted? How does that affect their belonging? People voluntarily told me about him, right? He came up in the community consciousness as somebody who belongs because of the way he acted. So a little bit more, I'll give you one specific story that shows some of these elements I'm talking about. So as I kind of hinted at earlier, he went to the war and came back, and he's seen as an Indigenous war veteran. So in our area of Ontario, there really wasn't a kind of like specific space for Indigenous veterans to celebrate their service in the war. So in Canada, you know, we have November 11th is a big deal. It's Remembrance Day. It's recognition of veterans. And Thunder Bay, the city next to us, had a Remembrance Day ceremony, but it was not necessarily designated for Indigenous peoples only. It was general. So over the course of decades, Frankie was concerned about this, and in the 90s, he created an Indigenous-specific Remembrance Day on our community, on our First Nation, that everybody's welcome to attend, but really this at the center is Indigenous veterans. So this is now an annual event. Frankie Banning passed away some time ago now, but the ceremony continues to happen every year in November. So what does this tell us about Frankie Banning? So Frankie's story shows that adoption is not necessarily a transactional thing, that you're adopted and then you get certain resources and benefits. It shows that it really just opens the possibility to be responsible to a specific nation. It also shows us, though, that Anishinaabe citizenship law, when seen through the lens of adoption, is really one of cyclical renewal. So the way I kind of think about this in academic terms is as co-constitutive, but really what I'm getting at there is that you renew your ties on a cyclical basis, whether they be annual in the sense of the Remembrance Day ceremony, or not annual in the sense that you show up every fall with firewood for the elders, or many other examples. But the way that I would argue that adoption translates into citizenship in the nation is that through this performance of responsibility and through this cyclical performance of responsibility, the community always has a chance to decide again and again and again to claim somebody. It's always up for another decision. So in Frankie's case, through the annual Remembrance Day ceremony, he not only upholds his responsibilities to the community, just as importantly, that annual ceremony allows the community to also claim him back every single year on an annual cyclical basis. So the Remembrance Day ceremony is actually now led by the First Nation Governance Council itself, like the administrative office. They have taken on responsibility to make sure that this happens every year. I would argue that that's them again saying, you are one of us because you've done everything that you were expected to do as an Anishinaabe citizen. We claim you again and again and again every year in November. You know, at that ceremony, people will narrate the story of Frankie Banning. Like dignitaries will say, we remember Frankie for starting this and all the things he did for us, etc. My point is, that's a far different narration than say, I'll just be a bit crass here, You know, Frankie was a non-Indigenous person who happened to be a member of our community, and we thank him for starting this ceremony. It's not how he's narrated. He's narrated as us. And that's critical because he's transited from the family adoption, my great-grandfather Jacob Bannon claiming him, to the community itself saying he is us. There's a big, big difference that is not automatic. It requires certain things to happen and that I argue are rest on certain principles of law and politics. So just to wrap up, adoption is really fraught. It's not as I mentioned earlier, it's not necessarily a straightforward concept. And in fact, having this conversation can be very triggering for some. There's been many people in Canada who were stolen from their communities and families through processes that were labeled adoption, but were really not. They were state-sponsored kidnapping, brought Indigenous children into residential schools, and etc. So adoption is not necessarily always, as I write here, it can be a dirty word. But parsing out the kind of threads that make it complicated doesn't necessarily mean that we have to throw away the baby with the bathwater, right? There is a space for seeing adoption as part of a citizenship order that is good and is based in inherent law and customary law. And as I kind of pointed to through this conversation with about Frankie Banning, it's also an expression of self-determination. So adoption is inherently a self-determining act. The family has to self-determine to do this step, right? To choose to bring that child in, or in other contexts, to choose to bring that elder in. That comes with a whole bunch of responsibilities. And it's that kind of like very basis of self-determination that's critical, I would say now, as Indigenous nations are rebuilding their governing systems, including citizenship, that we can look to when we're asking hard questions about, if we're going to chart a way forward that's going to respect who we are as a people and the customs and the laws that we hold inherently, where can we find examples of self-determination that ensure that we're on a good path that reflect who we are, as opposed to having that pathway charted in a way that reproduces kind of the problematic logics of, say, the Indian Act or some other construction of Indianness. So that's it.
Thank you very much. My understanding is that in the United States, at least, there is a quantitative element to citizenship referred to as blood quantum. Yes. Is that applied in Canada? And if so, is it still in use?
Yes. So the answer is yes and no. It's not the same. So there are, as you point to, a lot of tribal governments in the United States will use a blood quantum-based tribal citizenship law or approach. So there was a time in Canadian legislative history where there was actual wording in legislation that said like a quarter Indian blood. That is no longer the case on its face. But there is a de facto blood quantum still in use in the Indian Act now. I didn't really touch on it because I don't want to really get us into the weeds, but in the Indian Act under Section 6, there basically is blood quantum without using the term. So a really quick, I hope I don't lose you here, there's two major subsections of that section, Section 6. And basically, if both of your parents are Indians according to the law, then if you have a child, that child will be a full Indian without using that term. It's just given a number, right? But if there's a couple iterations of this, but just to your point, that if a person who has only half Indian status, or half, we could, for our purposes now, we'll just say blood, even though that's not used, and that person has a child with somebody who does not have recognition as an Indian, even if they are Indigenous, their child will not be an Indian. So where it gets tricky, so that's the yes piece to my response to that, is that there is a similarity there. It's just cloaked in a different way. It's not on the surface. But where it's, I think, more, not more, but where I'm more concerned, I guess, is when First Nations start de facto adopting that as their system of determining belonging. There's a reason that that happens, I would say. It's when you're trying to survive violence, sometimes you have to take on the thing that allows you to live another day, right? So I'm not necessarily faulting First Nations that have taken control over their citizenship governance and deployed a certain blood quantum, whether it's the way I just described it or actually using the term blood quantum the way they use in the United States. I would say that we're at a moment now in the Canadian context where that kind of violence isn't necessarily present in the way it was 50 years ago. There's a different climate now that I would argue First Nations can go beyond that if they want to. Some have, but a lot haven't. So that's why it's yes and no.
My understanding is that many groups use blood quantum because they are concerned about what you refer to as pretend Indians.
Yes, yeah.
Who insinuate themselves into a group without basis.
Yeah. So I put that up just to draw attention in case you didn't see. I didn't touch on it when I was speaking, but that second last bullet point, pretendians, identity fraudsters, use adoption stories. So, blood quantum is, there's all, the question, I think what we're talking about here in that broadens it slightly, is that we're talking about boundary maintenance. Every nation needs to know who its citizens are, right? I think that's obvious to everybody. It's the how do you maintain those boundaries that we can get into situations where we're upholding violence or challenging it, right? And it's not ever gonna be black and white. But one of the big pressures now in Canada and the United States is the concept of pretendians, or the practice of pretendian, basically where non-Indigenous peoples claim to be Indigenous for benefits, often some sort of like a hiring benefit or a grant, right? So in the Canadian context, there's been a real push to, there's the common language of using pretendians, which is a really useful way to talk about this issue. But a lot of those who are challenging it in institutions are saying we need to use that in brackets identity fraud. The fraud element really kind of like shows why it's dangerous. It's not just someone saying like, oh, I'm going to go out for Halloween as an Indian, right? It's actually you're lying about your identity to grab some resource, right? So just to your point, blood quantum and other ways of maintaining those boundaries are being deployed in many different examples of doing so. Blood quantum in Canada, if you have a status card, if you're registered as an Indian, if you're a band member, there's all these different versions. And I guess part of my response is that there are layers of identity control that First Nations can use, including things like blood quantum, but not all of them are kind of like free of problems. Yeah. Thanks. Yes?
I'm fine.
Okay.
I just wanted to say that I very much appreciate your mindfulness and considered thoughts around how you present this as to us now.
Mm-hmm.
I think this is just a massive issue, which you've obviously dedicated your entire career to help towards. I hope, and I'm sure people recognise you for just that, the amount of deep consideration that you've had to put to bring this forth to us. So I recognise that, and I want to say a huge thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
It's helpful for me because, I have to be very careful to not just rely on commonsensical terminologies that I would use in the Canadian context. Mm-hmm. What I really like about being here right now is that there's a lot to be said about the treaty relationship that, say, my community has with, historically the Crown. That's been now moved over to the Canadian Crown, but there's a lot of conversation even at community level about saying things like, you'll hear like the Canadian Crown is not really upholding our treaty, so we have to go to the UK to have this conversation, right? So part of what I will inevitably do is report back to my community about how these conversations go here when I'm making mistakes and trying my best to unpack things in a certain way, right?
Well, I have the sense that we all on planet Earth are at a point where we need to level off and recognise with great respect one another in a global way. And it's time for that to happen, and so your right attitude and respect are absolutely everything. Personally, I'm adopted, you're adopted, we both know how that feels on an emotional level for whatever's happened to us in our lives. I've discovered in my DNA, which is a recent thing that people have been able to do, only the last 2 years ago, that I'm half American, which just fills me with great joy. And also I've spread my line back to someone called John Atwood, who was the governor of the people who landed on the Mayflower, and they owe their exact existence to the indigenous people for their survival. So the indigenous people actually were genuine, human and respectful enough to show these people how to sustain life. When you talk about it as a survival thing, I recognise your emotion when you say about violence. And violence comes from fear of loss, mainly. So it's all about understanding that you only get one go on planet Earth, and let's all do the best we can with that then.
Yeah.
So again, thank you.
Yeah, words to live by. Yeah, thanks for that. Yes, I agree.
Vicky?
You say that the adoption process is quite formally recognised by the circle of people that it's going to be part of. So, and you hinted that there was a rejection process as well.
There is.
So, could you tell us a little tiny bit more about that?
For sure. I'm glad you brought that up because I had to kind of whisk past it. So when I was doing my PhD research, I interviewed, just to put people to sleep for sure. I'll talk about the methodology for a second of my PhD research. I interviewed people who have some connection to adoption in my community. So not me, because it's not it wasn't an ethnography or autoethnography, but so I ended up speaking to 13 people, and those could be, it was quite broad in terms of what their connection could be. Some were adoptees, some were adopters, and some were children of adoptees, right? So they all had different angles to talk about. And it was really interesting, this piece. So I will unpack this, just give me 2 minutes to give you the context, because it is really interesting. So because of the way the legislation works, there are people who can belong with a First Nation and have a card or a paper, a document. And by and large, those people who may be adopted in ultimately are claimed, I would say, by and large. The community ultimately, in the end, like Frankie Banning, takes them in and says, yes, you're one of us. But that wasn't always the case. And one of the people that I was speaking with for interviewing for my dissertation work, they told me a story about 2 boys who were adopted into the community, had the paperwork, and ultimately were rejected by the families. And I said, well, why? What's the rationale here? And it was pretty straightforward, but it was something I hadn't really thought about in terms of why the community de facto, in a kind of like, it's not like they sat down and decided, but there was a narrative conversation that's always happening in the community, right? And one of the results of that conversation over 20 years was that, no, we don't really want to claim those 2 boys now that they're adults. And I said, well, why? And they said that because they never ever show up for us. They never, and I said, well, that could mean many different things. Tell me what it means to show up. And they gave me all these examples that to them were obvious, that to me I hadn't really thought about. I'll give you a couple. One is children in the community and families always come to events, whether they be feasts or giveaways or Christmas parties or whatever, right? They show up in those spaces and they form relationships, right? That's kind of like obvious, like that's a thing that all communities might do. But they gave me, to answer this question, I'm gonna give you the biggest surprise I had in my dissertation research. Without fail, most people I interviewed all brought up the reserves, like my community's school bus. And I was like, why are we talking about a school bus when we're talking about adoption and claiming and belonging? And it's not like I was asking this for the school bus. And the reason there's a school bus is because we live right next to the city of Thunder Bay. It's a 5-10 minute drive. And because of that, all the reserve children are brought into the city for school. There's no school on the reserve. And what they said was, when you ride that school bus, you're forced to sort out your relationships with all the other kids. Some you align with, some you don't. That's where the lines are drawn. But more importantly, when it comes to belonging and demonstrating responsibility for each other, it's when you get off the school bus and go into the schoolyard. Because by and large, a lot of the kids on the school bus are brown, and you go into the schoolyard and you're faced with a lot of white kids, and there's a lot of racialized violence. And it's who is going to show up for each other in that space. And so the claiming and the renewal process is also performed and plays out on the schoolyard over decades, right? And this is why people tend to know, like, I know that I can rely on this person who's behind me in whatever situation, whether it be violence or something else. So just to your question then, why were certain kids excluded? Those ones never did that. They never showed up. They never took those responsibilities seriously on the school ground. And the kids reported back to families, not in a formal sense, but in kind of like everyday sense, over years. And so by the time that those two boys grew up, and even though they have paperwork that say they belong with the community formally, so on a political level, there is a relationship there. But in terms of whether the community's opinion is they don't, right? Because they didn't show up and they didn't kind of ride the school bus. Like, that's literally how they would, that's the terminology they could use to tell me why those relationships were serious or not. By contrast, there was a woman she's a woman now, but she was adopted in the same period as those two boys. And she's not Indigenous as well by birth. And she's fully claimed by the community. But when I was interviewing her, she complained a lot. She said, people are always in my business. They're always trying to ask me even though they know I'm adopted, they know I belong, they're always giving me a hard time. And I'm really sick of it. Like, I should just belong and stop bothering me. You're always got your nose in my business. And it's been like this for decades, she was telling me. And I could hear her frustration, but actually I was really impressed by that. Because in my mind, even though it's an annoyance for her on an individual level, I see that as the community checking in on her. Just like they checked in on those boys and ultimately decided no, not you guys, but yes to you, this woman, right? So it's an interesting thing happening there, but it speaks to the collectivity, it speaks to the kind of openness that comes with adoption, like everybody knows these things, like these are not private matters. And it speaks to that renewal, like cyclical checking in, right? So in her case, they checked in all the time, in those boys' cases, they did too, but in the end, they decided no.
Thank you all again for braving the weather and coming. You're welcome if you want to come up and ask some questions, but it is time to close it down now.